And now we're going to look at the Great Society. In this section, the main idea is that President Johnson used his political skills to push Kennedy's proposals through Congress and expanded them to his own vision of the Great Society. Our learning objectives are to explain how and why LBJ was more successful in getting Kennedy's agenda passed, and explain the impact of the Great Society and LBJ's foreign policy. So we start by looking at Lyndon Johnson. As far as personality, Johnson was large and intense with none of Kennedy's polish or charm. He was hardworking and ambitious with a genuine desire to help others. And he really had a greater concern for the poor and underprivileged than Kennedy. He believed in an expanded role for government in making Americans' lives better. As far as political experience, Johnson started as a school teacher in Texas, and then he served as a Texas congressman. Then he served as a U.S. senator. And he served as a majority leader in the Senate after one term as the senator. So he was pretty successful to have, after only one term, emerged as the majority leader. By 1960, Johnson had more influence in Washington, D.C. than any other Democrat. So the beginning of Johnson's presidency, his mastery of the political process along with his years of experience in Washington, allowed Johnson to make a smooth transition to the presidency. He vowed to continue to carry on the new frontier. Johnson called on members of Congress to pass Kennedy's programs so that Kennedy did not die in vain. Johnson wanted to go beyond Kennedy's administration's plans, and he sponsored anti-poverty programs, tax cut bills, and civil rights legislation. As far as enacting Kennedy's agenda, Johnson declared a war on poverty. Kennedy was influenced by Michael Harrington's The Other America, a study of poverty that shattered the popular belief that all Americans had prospered from the country's post-war prosperity. Johnson launched the war on poverty when he asked Congress to pass the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. This act funded several new anti-poverty programs. The Job Corps offered work training programs for unemployed youth. VISTA was a domestic version of the Peace Corps. Other programs provided education for adults, work for unemployed parents, and help to fight rural poverty and to assist migrants. Johnson pushed for the passage of Kennedy's tax cut bill. Congress demanded that the president promise to hold government spending to $100 billion. Johnson used the press to help him convince Congress to pass the Tax Reduction Act of 1964. The nation's economy grew by more than 10% and unemployment declined. Johnson pushed for the passage of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. After a year of debate, Congress passed the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, Johnson told the nation that he had his own plans for the United States, and he called the domestic programs of his administration the Great Society. So looking at the 1964 election, in order to launch Johnson's Great Society, he needed to win the 1964 election. He chose Herbert Humphrey as his running mate, and the Republicans selected Barry Goldwater as their nominee. Barry Goldwater's views were very different from Johnson's. He suggested using nuclear weapons to end Vietnam. And he attacked the Great Society with claims that people were only equal in the eyes of God and that government programs to help people were similar to communism. Creating the Great Society. Some of the programs included the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was the first large-scale program of government aid to public schools. The Higher Education Act created the first federal scholarships for needy college students. Head Start was an education program for preschool children of low-income parents. Omnibus Housing Act created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Medicaid. This was a program that provides free health care for poor people. Medicare was a health care program for people over 65. The Great Society emphasized the environment. Laws were passed to improve water and air quality. Lady Bird Johnson worked to preserve the outdoors and natural beauty of the United States. For example, she pushed for the Highway Beautification Act, which later became known as Lady Bird's Bill. Between 1965 and 1966, Congress passed 181 of the 200 major bills that President Johnson requested. Some members of Congress were concerned about the rapid pace of reform. The midterm elections of 1966 allowed Republicans to gain seats in both houses of Congress, which slowed down Johnson's legislative programs. The new Congress did enact some Great Society programs, such as the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, which created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Public Broadcasting Systems, or PBS, and NPR, National Public Radio. The Truth in Lending Act was passed in 1967, and a 1968 law to establish the nation's Wild and Scenic Rivers program. As far as Johnson's foreign policy, we have to first look at the Vietnam War. By the end of 1966, some 385,000 U.S. combat troops were in Vietnam, and the government was spending $2.5 billion a month on the war. And this raises an issue because we cannot have both guns and butter, with guns referring to military spending and butter referring to domestic spending. So ultimately, many of Johnson's programs had to be cut back. We also have the Johnson Doctrine, which was a policy dictating that revolutions in Latin America were more than local concerns if communism was involved. Johnson sent troops to end a revolt in the Dominican Republic in 1965. As far as relations with the Soviet Union, he continued Kennedy's effort to improve relations with the Soviet Union. He signed the treaty to prevent each country's diplomats from harassment by authorities in the other country. The United States and Soviet Union, along with 58 other nations, signed an agreement to ban weapons in outer space. And we also faced an incident known as the Pueblo Incident. In January of 1968, North Korea captured a U.S. Navy ship, the Pueblo, off the coast of communist North Korea. The United States claimed that it was in international waters and called up troops. The North Koreans released the crew but kept the ship.